G'day! Today we're going to talk about ecosystem services, which is the idea that we pay the ecosystems for the services that they provide. So we'll talk a little bit more of that and how it has functioned in places where it actually has been implemented. So to start off with, simple review of past classes, what is an ecosystem? And this is where I'd ask you guys, but I'll just tell you. We all know ecosystems are dynamic, they change. They have biotic and abiotic parts to them, right? Ecosystems are not just the critters and the plants that we find in it, it's also the water and the rocks and the weather that is in effect in that ecosystem. They all interact together, and many people would include humans as part of that ecosystem, even though some people do not like to include humans. But part of ecosystem services is starting to recognize that humans are part of these ecosystems, whether we should be or not, and that we need to start accepting that and giving back to those ecosystems. Ecosystem boundaries is a little bit more difficult. Some ecosystems are easily defined. Examples of that are drainage basins. A pond ecosystem has a fairly definitive boundary around it. Most wetlands have pretty easy boundaries around them, but other ones are a little bit harder to say, like this ecosystem ends here. If there's a forest with a field beside, you get a nice easy boundary, but if you have a conifer forest that blends in, into a broadleaf forest, it's a little bit harder. The species can go in between. The boundaries are less cut and dry. Sometimes you get ecosystems that are totally self-contained and completely cut off from other ecosystems. They're very rare. There's a few examples of cave ecosystems or plateau ecosystems that have these sorts of completely self-sufficient, but most of them have very strong boundaries with or strong relationships with the ecosystems beside them. You can't just pull one ecosystem out. The ones nearby rely upon them. So once we understand what an ecosystem is, we can start to understand about the services that they provide to us. And again, this is a point where I would usually stop and get you guys to start telling me what you think ecosystems provide us with. And sometimes it can be an interesting conversation. So stop for a second and think about it. Think about the things that the ecosystems give you. They can be grouped into categories. So one is provisional services. So these are things that it provides us that we consume, like food and water. Apple trees give us apples. All ecosystems, we don't have a working water cycle on this planet without ecosystems that work properly. Then, so those provisional services, those ecosystems give us food and water, they provide us with those, but lots of ecosystems regulate stuff for us. So they cause disease control or flood control. A great example of this is removing the mangrove forests in Asia for resorts. So you have a beachfront, sandy beachfront resort, but then without those mangrove forests, those communities get flooded because those forests were providing flood attenuation. Some of these ecosystems provide cultural services, so these can be religious or spiritual, but they can also just be recreational. Like, I like to go bird walking in a forest. You probably have forests that you like to walk in or other ecosystems you like to go to. And then there's the ones that we don't really see very often. So we sort of take for granted the supporting services they produce. So all those different nutrient cycles that Dave Hackett loves to talk about in first year, all of those are done by our ecosystems without us even thinking about it. So another way of looking at this is it's very easy to notice that these ecosystems provide us with clean water and food to eat. Instant effect, And it's easy to be like, okay, we're going to take these apples and we'll pay for that service. We're going to take this water and pay per liter for that service. It's a pretty cut and dry. The regulating services are harder because we need them. They're super important, but because the effect is delayed, not everyone always sees that, so it takes some time. An example of this is there was a serious river flood issue in Toronto. I'm trying to remember if it was the Don River Valley or the Humber River Valley. And then the same year in North Bay, Chippewa Creek was flooded. It was probably like the year of Hurricane Hazel, because that was a crazy weather year. But it meant that these cities took away properties and created parkland along all those rivers. So Chippewa Creek has a lot of parkland in the flood zones, in those floodplains. And so does that's Don River and Humber River have large flood zones now. And that is a regulating service that without, they really got hit hard. So they respected that and protected it. Should we pay for those services? It's another harder one to talk about. Cultural services, I would argue that we need them greatly, but a lot of people undervalue them. Do we really need that park to play in? Do we really need that forest? It's a much harder argument to make. And then the nutrient cycling, like I said, like we need this. We're using it right now all the time, but because we just take for granted, we don't see how it works or understand how it works, people just accept that that's happening, that the carbon cycle is happening, whether the forest is there or not, when in fact, without that forest, it probably wouldn't happen quite so well. So those ecosystem services are also part of Earth system services. So this is a little bit less well understood. So we have these planetary boundaries where if we start messing with those ecosystems, the things that the Earth does stops working. So these are like big picture, not like little things that ecosystems do, but ecosystems all together give us services. These are the Earth system services. So this is like climate is an Earth system service. So us screwing up those ecosystems is causing climate change. Biodiversity is an Earth system service. So we're causing biodiversity loss. All of those cycles that we were talking about, so like nitrogen and phosphorus levels on a global scale, our ozone problem, the ocean acidification is messing with our Earth system services, right? The fact that we have fresh water and that water cycle. All of these are sort of large picture. When you start messing with these ecosystems, we start losing these big services as well as those local services. And that brings me to talk about the Holocene. So the entire time humans have been on this planet, we've been in a part of history that anthropologists call the Holocene. And the Holocene is a really stable weather time. So climatically, the temperature hasn't really changed much for the last how many thousands of years that humans have been here, through the whole Holocene. It was super, super stable. It's probably what allowed humans to thrive. It's what allowed civilizations to happen, because we weren't having to deal with these extreme climatic events. Those 5 mass extinctions that we haven't talked about yet, that we'll talk about in maybe the next lecture, were caused by crazy climatic changes. That Holocene has been a pretty nice, stable period. Because humans are messing with this Holocene, this stable period, we're messing up the climate hugely. A lot of anthropologists and paleontologists are starting to call now an Anthropocene, anthro being man, that the humans are the driving force that is affecting our Earth right now, that our climate is being affected by humans, that everything is being affected by humans. and even our geologic layers are going to be affected by humans. We're going to have millions of years from now, you'll be able to tell when the Anthropocene happened because of the huge carbon and plastic layer in the fossil record at some point. So if we want to keep this Holocene, we need to respect those Earth system services. To keep those Earth system services, we need to protect those individual ecosystems. To protect those Earth system services is hard. They're big, right? And they need some global decisions. And one of them is happening. The UN is currently working to put all international ocean waters as protected fishing grounds. So humans will only be allowed to fish in waters owned by their country. All international waters will be protected. That is a United Nations is trying to push forward to this, so a global decision to protect an Earth system service. That's a good thing, but those systems are really hard to do. The UN can't just make that decision alone, and then once they make it, the rest of the world has to agree to follow that rule. So it's a difficult sort of situation to make happen. Protecting ecosystem services, which affect those Earth system services, is easier because you can have one ecosystem within a country, you can have one ecosystem within a city, and you can make a group of people in a city or a group of people in a country or province agree to follow rules and protect that one ecosystem. We historically haven't, though. Generally, it's been a big, long history of humans taking what they want, often taking what they need, but often taking more than they need. So we have history of this, of overhunting, over-harvesting, creating giant reservoirs, turning all of the arable land into farmland, which is not necessarily environmentally friendly. Is that history sustainable? Well, we've shown that a lot of hunting practices weren't sustainable because species did go extinct. Through much of the world, hunting is regulated at a point where it is sustainable, not everywhere, but in most places now, legal hunting has diminished to a sustainable point, but it's because we farm the animals we need. So is that sustainable? That's a whole nother issue. I just literally yesterday watched David Attenborough's witness statement about the planet, where he talks about everyone needing to have plant-based diets. So the agricultural systems we have, he points out, are definitely not sustainable, and probably globally the way we eat is not sustainable. So coming up with systems that are going to be really important if we're going to protect those Earth systems as well as those ecosystems. So we're doing some of this already. Laws are currently changing. People are changing. How many of you guys watching this now have changed your diet to eat less meat in the last 5 years as knowledge about animal agriculture has changed? Are people going to make that difference? Are we going to do it in time? Do we need laws to force us to? Can we do it just because we care? So the problem with it is that a lot of these systems that we have in place are unsustainable, and they're causing a loss of biodiversity. So this is one of the biggest problems, is this loss of biodiversity. And to fix that, we need to give more space to the plants and animals that we've taken away from them. So protecting these wild spaces, protecting these ecosystems to promote biodiversity is important. So how can we do this? How can we make ourselves become more sustainable? How can we force humans to make sustainable decisions? I want to talk about a specific ecosystem service, water, because water is So important to life. In many places, it's considered a right, not a privilege. You need water to survive. And most countries have water systems in place. And many countries have been going through very long years of drought. This is part of climate change. So there are some really interesting water initiatives in terms of paying for water. So, as I was saying, water is needed. Everyone needs water. But there's only so much on the planet, and there are more and more people. So we all need water. There's more of us. There's only so much fresh water out there. So less than 1% of the water in the world is actually drinkable water. And less than 1/100th of that 1% is renewed by the hydrological cycle. So like, we think about all the water we have, and very little of it is actually accessible to humans. So it's a big deal. Water scarcity has become a huge problem. As humans, we have a history of using and abusing our water resources. I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again throughout this course, is that human need always trumps ecosystem need. If there is a water source that is diminishing and the plants and animals need that water, if there's also a village of humans that need that water, they will use that water and nobody cares if the plants and animals survive because the human lives come first. A great example of this are the Aral Sea and the Colorado River. So here's the Aral Sea. When I was a kid, most maps showed the Aral Sea like this large sea. It's huge. It's near the Caspian Sea, right between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, or Kazakhstan. When I was a kid, this is what the Aral Sea looked like, where you've got this large peninsula forming and the boundaries are different. So there's like actual villages on the shore of the old lake that are no longer on the shore. And when this started to happen, the country that's up here, so I guess it's Kazakhstan, put a dam. So the water coming downstream this way was blocked. So this water was protected from the incoming at the expense of the people down here taking water from the sea on this side. Because this is an international boundary, this was a big deal, like affecting the downstream countries. So now it's at a point where they have like a South Aral Sea and a North Aral Sea. The Aral Sea, like this is 2002, it's 2020. Go look at it on a map on a Google Earth. It's practically not there anymore. This is a desert area, doesn't get a lot of water anymore, and a lot of communities are having to move because they used to live on this giant water body that no longer exists. So that's one example of not caring about the ecosystem and taking until it's gone. This is the Colorado River. All the red marks from the Aral Sea are still there. The Colorado River is that big river that runs through the Grand Canyon. That giant Grand Canyon, that giant river. It flows through deserts of the United States, and the people of the United States take all the water out of the Colorado River so that this right here is what hits the Mexican border. Of that giant river, huge amounts of water. This tiny little trickle, right? This is a human in a little dinghy. They're portaging around this little dam into Mexico. This is the amount of water that Americans leave for Mexicans. It doesn't even reach the ocean anymore. It used to be a huge delta in Mexico where you have that long peninsula and then you go down to Mexico. Colorado River used to empty in here, and this delta is a huge, important ecosystem because of that big influx of fresh water. And that's not happening anymore because there's too many people living in the deserts in the arid parts of the United States, taking more water than their share. Here is a good story. Yay, after those sad stories about the Aral Sea and the Colorado River. This is about how we can conserve our water. So this is the Boston Reservoir. Sort of behind me here, but you can see the city of Boston here, and there's the greater city of Boston, and then the greater Boston area that are all using water. It's a lot of people. So they built a reservoir. I've lost my thing. They built a reservoir, and that wasn't enough. So they built another reservoir here, and that wasn't enough. And they kept needing more and more water. So they built another reservoir, and they built the Quabbin. So this was a really huge undertaking when they built the Quabbin Reservoir. It's massive. You can see how big a lake that is compared to these other little reservoirs. It was a big deal. And they were still running out of water. So you can see down here, one second, this is where Boston is in Massachusetts. And they're taking water that flows down to the ocean this way. They're running out of water, so they're going to build a huge pipeline over into this water system and start taking water out of this river system and piping it over to Boston. So this is a huge undertaking to go over a water drainage basin system. And it was going to cost a lot. So the city of Boston looked at the costs and effects, and it said, okay, so let's start conserving our water and see what can happen. And they started giving tax breaks to people who installed efficient water systems, like efficient faucets and efficient shower heads. They started going through the entire city and fixing all the pipes. So all the outdated, Boston's a very old city. So they went through, and instead of spending millions of dollars making a new pipeline, they used that money to go and repair all of the old existing pipelines inside the city of Boston. They gave audits to all the industrial areas. So all the industry in Boston had to do complete overhauls of their water systems. And the result of this is they dropped their water use by 43%. So that Quabbin Reservoir is more than enough water for them. No need to build that pipeline over to a new watershed. This is a sort of system that could work in a lot of places. There are so many inefficiencies. There's so much water in North America that we take for granted how much there is, and we don't conserve it to the extent that we should. And I think all cities should do something like Boston did. Before I talk about Andhra Pradesh, I should talk about more recently, just the other year in South Africa, they were having a water crisis, and they had a countdown to when they were going to run out of water. And the people again conserved, and they never did hit that countdown of when they were going to run out, because with an actual set date of we need to fix this now or else, people made the accommodations that they should have made years ago. All right, water co-ops. So this is really cool. In India, there's a lot of provinces in India, and I don't know them all, but Andhra Pradesh is one of those states or provinces of India. And they were one that was having water problems. So they created a water co-op where rather than every farmer fighting to try and get enough water for their farm, all the farmers pay into the co-op to share the water equally amongst everyone. So they created a water budget. They're like, this is how much water we have in this state. This is how many farmers we have. This is how many people in cities we have. How do we stick to our water budget? And so as a state, they decided, okay, if we're going to stick to this water budget so everyone has enough water, then we need to shift our crops. And it wasn't just one farmer shifting crops to a lake, because it's the crops that pay more are the ones that take more water. So it can't be like one farmer deciding to choose a more water-friendly option because they're going to make less money and all of the people around them are going to keep taking more water. So the entire state shifted to less thirsty crops, but that meant that they were able to get higher yields because they have crops that can work in the water budget. So everyone increased their profits because everyone was working together, not fighting against each other. It's a really cool system, and it's happened in a couple of different Indian states now. Oh, here's the Cape Town water caps. I thought they were the other way around. Oh my word. So this is the idea of how much water do you need, and should we start charging above and beyond that? Because we don't like charging humans for water. It's a necessity of life. But we also need to charge for the systems of water. So everyone gets so many liters of water for this low price or free, and you have to pay an extra amount for going over it. So that's the idea of water caps, that if you can live within this amount of water, then you only pay this low price and just enough to keep the water systems running. If you want to use more than that, then you have to pay this premium extra price. And it's one way to limit water use without overcharging everyone. Because when you start putting some of these some of these charges into effect, it's the poor and underprivileged people that end up suffering. So water price caps, where you get extra water, sort of is hoping to help with that. So there's enough water for the people who need it. And then if you're overspending, that's your choice. You're still going to have, and this is where it starts arguing, where you're always going to have rich people taking advantage of the system. If you start putting prices like that on things, would people actually use less, or would it become a status symbol? Oh, I just waste water because I have money. So, and people argue that with the Cape Town thing that I was just talking about, because when given this ultimatum of day zero until we turn off all the taps, there's no water left, it never happened, people cut back. There's a Netflix video on that called World Water Crisis. So then we come into actual paying for ecosystem services. And when there's discussions about ecosystem services, a lot of time the discussion is around paying for those services. So in South America, there's something called the Fund for the Protection of Water. It's called FONAG because it's in Spanish or Incan, not in English, but in Quito, which is in Ecuador, and I think it's in Peru as well, people pay for the water services. So you don't know you're paying for it, it's on your water bill. So I pay $60 for my water per month, and 20 of that is a delivery charge, and 20 of that is a storage charge, and 20 of that is an ecosystem service charge. And that ecosystem service charge goes to protecting the water source, which is pretty neat because some of those funds go to protecting rainforests upstream that create that river in the first place. And some of it goes to support farmers in cropland so that they have the education required to help protect that water source. And some of it goes to education in schools so that all the schools have the necessary funds to teach about water protection. And some of it goes to like the equivalent of the MNRF, where there's people going and checking on the river quality regularly and checking on the ecosystems regularly. And it's a really cool sort of idea. You do need to have someone looking after it. So in this case, the government has set up sort of like an MNRF that's in charge of the FONAG, that the funds coming in, they're making sure those funds are being distributed to protect that water source. So if you wanted to do this for any ecosystem, say we wanted to start charging someone for the ecosystem services that this particular forest has, then someone needs to be in charge of how that money gets distributed. Where does that money come from? Where does that money go? Makes it a little bit more difficult. So these are government services. There's places where we've had crowdfunding. So there's an organization called the BC Parks Foundation. So they're a private charity. They are not answerable to the government. They're not BC Parks. BC Parks is a government organization. BC Parks Foundation, charitable organization. And when there's something going on where BC Parks wish that they owned this extra piece of land because they want to protect from logging, or BC Parks wish that they could do this initiative, but they don't have the funding, BC Parks Foundation gets the money to put into those different properties. So one of the things they did was the Princess Louisiana Inlet, which was private property, which was scheduled to be logged, was purchased by the BC Parks Foundation through crowdfunding, and they're hoping to add it to Crown land to create a giant park with the help of the BC Parks. So stuff like this is a really great way of paying back those ecosystem services. You can't talk about protecting our global ecosystems without talking about sustainable oceans, because basically the ocean is one giant global water fund. And how do we protect it globally? Because you could protect all the oceans in Canada and it would make a huge difference. But those oceans are connected to the oceans in the United States and the oceans in Russia and the oceans in England and Iceland and France and Africa. Like, they're all connected. So it becomes more difficult. It's more obvious in places like Passamaquoddy Bay, where New Brunswick and Nova Scotia meet Maine. And there's literally a line that if you cross in your boat, the Coast Guard comes and yells at you because you're crossing international borders. And the lobster fishing season north of that line in Canada is more restricted than the lobster fishing season south of that in the United States. And the fishermen fight over this. The lobsters have no idea where the boundary is. And that's not including the rights and regulations of the indigenous people, which right now is being fought over in that part of the world. So we all need to work together if we're going to protect those species. So some of the things we're working at is looking at aquaculture, because currently large-scale fisheries are fishing wild stocks and none of them are sustainable. We're eating too many fish. Most of these fisheries are so unsustainable that the fishermen no longer make enough money to survive without government subsidies. Most of the American fisheries are subsidized through the government so that those fishermen can continue doing what they do. A lot of agriculture globally is subsidized because we want to keep food costs low enough that everyone can afford them, but they're not sustainable. So if we want to protect global oceans, we need to eliminate large-scale fisheries, which means we need to make sustainable aquaculture. Just like with hunting, we're no longer hunting wild deer, so the deer population is stable, but that's because we're eating farmed deer and farmed cows and farmed sheep and pigs. So we need to make agriculture that's sustainable. We need to make aquaculture that's sustainable. And this is why talk of plant-based diets comes up, because it takes less nutrients, less resources. We also need to start talking about city planning. So sewage runoff, and I have a whole class on this. Oh wait, that's in soil science. Sewage runoff is a huge deal because in North Bay we have a sewage treatment plant so that we're not just dumping our raw sewage into Lake Nipissing. But cities that are situated on the ocean don't. The city of St. John's has only recently started to do sewage treatment, And it's a huge endeavor because they're the oldest city in Canada and they have plumbing underneath that city that is older than the city of North Bay, older than the country of Canada. So trying to redo the entire piping system underneath the city of St. John's so that they have sewage treatment is taking a long time and costing a lot of money. It's easier just to pipe it right into the bay. The city of Victoria still just puts all of its sewage directly into the ocean. Pretty much all of the major ocean cities still put all of their sewage directly into the ocean. So this is a big part of protecting our global ocean, is thinking about all those things like that. Another big one is CO2. The oceans are being acidified from all of the carbonic acid. The only way to solve that is to lessen the amount of CO2 going into the air. So that's a long-term global initiative. So before we leave on this topic, I want to talk about forestry as an ecosystem service, because this is something that Jeff Deck talks about in one of his classes. In Ontario, we already have our forests in these lovely little forest management units. And each one of these forest management units have a board of people who are responsible for taking care of that forest. And no decisions get made about how that forest is sustained without a whole group of people getting together. So people on that board include local foresters, but they also include people like Jeff Deck, people like me, people like you. Any random person off the street can be a part of this board. It has to include forestry experts, it has to include local foresters, and it has to include folks from the MNR. But beyond that, anyone else can sit on this board. And there's been talk about starting to make some kind of ecosystem service around these forestry units, where everyone who lived within that forestry unit would have some kind of a tax for using that forest added that went to that board to help sustain and manage that forest. So you could, for example, have like, so North Bay is in this is the Nipissing Forest. So these forests help keep fresh water in all of these waterways. So all the communities in this forest would then pay a tax to that forest, and the people who are in charge of that forest would have to make sure that all of the waterways are protected and put that money into creating areas that aren't getting logged and aren't getting developed on those waterways. So it's an interesting idea. Will it come to pass? I don't know, but it's one way that you could institute ecosystem services in Ontario. One example I haven't talked about yet is, oh, the sun has just gotten really bright and now you can't see me at all, is in Costa Rica, they were depending upon agriculture as their main source of income for the whole country, and it was not sustainable, and they were losing diversity, and as a country decided to start paying for the ecosystem services, and it meant that they have decreased their agriculture, increased their ecotourism, and increased their forests and increased their biodiversity. And it's been a system that's worked really well for them so far. They're a really good success story in ecosystem services. We could be one of them. We could be the next ecosystem service success story.